It's time to begin another major league for what ifs. And this time it's about time we did the NHL. Besides being Canadian and all of that, I have to go to my roots. This is part one, and today our first one will focus on the 1993 Toronto Maple Leafs. But enough about the team that I've just tipped my hand about. Let's talk about the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Toronto Maple Leafs were once called the Toronto Arenas when they started off in the first ever NHL season of 1917-18. They were with the Montreal Canadiens, Ottawa Senators, and the Montreal Wanderers. The Quebec Bulldogs almost were in the league, but they had troubles with players, so they couldn't play in the first ever season. However, that 1918 season was the pinnacle part as the Toronto Arenas defeated the Montreal Canadiens and Ottawa Senators on their way to the first ever NHL crown and a Challenge Cup against the Pacific champions from Vancouver. Now, if you don't know, and I know a lot of people don't know, that in 1918 they still had they decided to have the winner of the National Hockey League, which was the successor to the National Hockey Association, NHA, play the team out west, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, or PCHA for short, for the Stanley Cup, East versus West. And the PCHA had reason to be happy because Seattle won the cup in 1917. So they had the cup. Toronto would take on Vancouver, and in a rush, they actually decided to play by Western rules and Eastern rules. The biggest thing about the Western rules compared to the Eastern rules was that the Western teams had 7 players on the ice, whereas the East had 6 players. The East obviously is left wing, right wing, center, left defense, right defense, and goalie. But they put a rover in that basically was playing between the defense and the wings for the Western teams, the 7th player. And the Western teams actually did allow goalies to go down to the ice for a save and allow forward passing in a neutral zone. Now, of course, hockey is way different now than it was 100 years ago. That forward passing was only in the defensive zone. It couldn't be in the offensive zone. They fixed that problem after too many shutouts in 1929-30. So anyway, the Toronto Arenas won the first ever Stanley Cup for an NHL team, beating Vancouver in 5 games. In 1922, the Leafs, now called the St. Pats, won the second Stanley Cup in franchise history. In 1927, amid rumors that the Toronto Maple Leafs were going to fly the coop and head to Philadelphia, Conn Smythe, a major in the Canadian infantry in World War I, got his business partners in him to pull an offer of $200,000. No small feat in 1927 dollars. Even today, like 90 plus years later, 200,000 is still big. But for that price, the Toronto Maple Leafs were born. Toronto kept a hockey team in the major city that they inhabit, and all seemed right with the world. Conn Smythe decided to change the name from the St. Pats to the Maple Leafs because of the Maple Leaf Regiment in his infantry, and basically gave it a blue and white makeover from a green and white thing. The Leafs still wear St. Pat's jerseys to the state, like near St. Patrick's Day. They're cool. So the Toronto Maple Leafs, the first Stanley Cup that they won as the Toronto Maple Leafs was 1932 against the New York Rangers. Ironically, that was just months after they opened up one of the biggest arenas in Canada, that being Maple Leaf Gardens. The weird thing about Maple Leaf Gardens is it was built in 9 months, which is no mean feat. Today, like most stadiums can only take like 2 years to be built, but Maple Leaf Gardens was 9 months. A lot of things happened with the Toronto Maple Leafs that made this happen, especially the fact that the Leafs brass decided to use Foster Hewitt and the newly created National Radio Network to say that they would be selling a special program about how Maple Leaf Gardens would be built. And for 10 cents, remember, this is during the Depression, people can write in and get a free program and all that. They ended up getting 91,000 program requests. At 10 cents, that's That's $910,000. So that's about $9,100. And that convinced a lot of people to put money into this project that they wanted this to happen. Obviously, of course, the Great Depression was working hard on people. And thankfully, Conn Smythe talked to the labor unions and said, we'll give you some stock in exchange for us cutting wages. You can have stock in Maple Leaf Gardens. And many of them agreed. So they built it in 9 months. The Leafs did lose their first ever game at Maple Leaf Gardens 2-1 to the Chicago Blackhawks. Ironic that 68 years later, when they closed, 68 years later, they closed Maple Leaf Gardens. They played the Blackhawks and lost 6-2. By the way, Bob Probert, if you must know, scored the last goal at Maple Leaf Gardens. He was a Blackhawk. But anyway, Bob Probert. Amazing. So anyway, Bob Probert aside, the Leafs in 1932 won the Stanley Cup against the Rangers. The Leafs would not really have a lot of success in getting a few more Stanley Cups. They did win a famous Stanley Cup triumph in 1942 when they basically came back from 3-0 down against the Detroit Red Wings and won that series. Unheard of at the time. Even more so, the Leafs actually benched a few star players for some lunch bucket players. Basically, it was Nick Metz coming up for Gord Drillin, if you will. The Leafs had some great lines, like the kid line of Primo, Conacher, and Busher Jackson, which were huge in the 30s. But in the 40s, the Leafs made a great comeback in 42. However, that also happened to be when Jack Adams, the coach of the Red Wings, and a tyrant of that, I'll get more into that when I talk about the Red Wings, basically punched referee Mal Harwood out in Game 4, after Game 4 for missing some calls. Adams was booted for the rest of the series, and the Leafs took advantage of momentum to win at Maple Leaf Gardens in front of 16,000 plus fans in Game 7, which was one of the biggest Canadian hockey audiences, live audiences in history. The Leafs would go on to win in 1945, 47, 48, and 49. So they won 5 Stanley Cups in the 1940s. That's amazing. They were the team of the 40s. The Leafs would go on to win the Stanley Cup in 1951 as Bill Barocco scored a famous overtime goal over the shoulder of Jerry McNeil of the Montreal Canadiens. Barocco was supposed to play back, but he wanted to play forward and shot the puck in the net. The Leafs brass didn't mind him. Unfortunately, Barocco's star was broken as he was found to be missing after a fishing trip to Timmins with his friend Dr. Henry Hudson. They didn't know what would happen. One of the biggest air search and rescue missions in Canada was held at that time. So anyway, the Toronto Maple Leafs had problems after Barocco's death. 11 years later, they finally won a Stanley Cup, that being in 1962. However, shocking as it was, that summer in 62, they found the plane and they found the skeletal remains of Hudson and Barocco. Seems to a lot of people that they had too much weight, especially with the fish and all that, and it brought them down in a wooded area. So it's weird how during Barocco's 11 years of not being found, the Leafs couldn't win a Stanley Cup, and then in 62 they won the Cup. The Leafs then won the Cup in 63 and 64 for their second three-peat. The Leafs in 1967, their biggest win in a long time. They had lots of players. They had 11 players 30 years or older, especially the goalies Johnny Bower and Terry Sawchuk. Both those goalies helped the Leafs shock the Chicago Blackhawks in the 1967 playoffs, leading them to the Stanley Cup Finals against their old rivals, the Montreal Canadiens. And the Leafs beat the Canadiens in 6 games. No thanks to George Armstrong's empty net goal to seize Game 6, or Bob Pulford's double overtime Game 3 winner. I believe that was Game 3. Yeah, it was Game 3. Unfortunately, since 1967, the Leafs have not been to the Stanley Cup Finals, let alone win a Stanley Cup. They've had 4 golden chances to get to a Stanley Cup Final. First golden chance was 1978, when the Leafs didn't really have much of a balanced team. The Leafs were one of the biggest teams to be hit by the World Hockey Association, especially with Harold Ballard being a tight ass, if you will. There will be plenty of profanities about Harold Ballard in this report. So anyway, I digress. The Leafs had a chance in 1978. They were facing the New York Islanders, the up-and-coming New York Islanders, who basically were building their team through the draft and looking pretty good. And somehow, in some way, the 1978 Leafs forced a Game 7 against the New York Islanders at the Nassau Coliseum on Long Island. Both teams won their home games, so basically, it probably would have been the Islanders. Mike Bossy got injured by a wayward stick, and the fans were crying foul in Long Island. The Leafs came close. 1-1 tie when all of a sudden Lanny McDonald got a perfect pass from Ian Turnbull, slid it past Chico Resch, and the Leafs were going to the Stanley Cup semifinals for the first time in 11 years. The Leafs were going to lose that series to the Montreal Canadiens in 4 straight. Can't blame the Leafs because, I mean, it was the Canadiens, and they were a freaking powerhouse in the late 70s, so that obviously means they're not the what if I should be doing. The Leafs, unfortunately, would go under a steady decline, especially in the 1980s. Basically, Harold Ballard wanted Punch Imlach to bring some necessity to the team. But it was only because Scotty Bowman and Don Cherry both declined chances to be in the Leafs organization as coach and GM. Bowman was given a golden chance to be coach or GM because Bowman left Montreal because he was pissed off that he didn't get the GM spot and Irving Grudman got it. But Scotty Bowman also knew that Harold Ballard would be basically meddling in everyone's affairs. Don Cherry was the next best chance. Don Cherry was just fired from Boston after his Game 7 fiasco in the 79 Stanley Cup semifinals against the Habitants. Don Cherry always dreamed of wearing the blue and white or being affiliated with the Leafs. Besides, he's from Kingston. Unfortunately, Don Cherry's morals, brought by his mom, was Ballard's decline. Cherry said that he had made a verbal agreement with the Colorado Rockies, who are now the New Jersey Devils, by the way, and said that I have to give him my word. That's the way I live and all that. Unfortunately, that meant that Punch Imlach would now become the GM, and Punch Imlach was kind of a douchebag, if you will. Imlach always believed that his teams lacked the discipline and all that. Of course, this is a 1960s coach in the 1970s/80s, if you will. So basically, Imlach thought that because his Sabres agreed to everything around it, because he was coaching GM of the Sabres for a while, that he could mold this team into that. Unfortunately, times had changed. Ballard and Imlach were responsible for the downfall of the team in the 80s, especially Daryl Sittler, who actually said that they wouldn't play an exhibition game against the Canadian Olympic team because of some problems with Alan Eagleson and all that. So unfortunately, they needed to get rid of Sittler. Wrong way around. Unfortunately, Sittler had the no trade deal. So basically, they wanted to hurt Sittler so bad, they decided to trade Lanny McDonald, the second in command of the Leafs, and sent him to Colorado with Don Cherry to pick up. Colorado sending back Joe Quenneville and Wolf Paymon, among others. The Leafs lost their heart and soul. But due to Punch Imlach suffering multiple heart attacks, Harold Ballard actually loosened up with Sittler. But unfortunately, Sittler knew his time was up with the Leafs, so he basically wasn't going to be offended they traded him. So he ended up with Philly and Detroit at the end of his career. Poor Sittler. The 80s were like, the Leafs made playoff series, but unfortunately they were in a 5-team division, and in the 80s they made the rule that the top 4 teams from each division would move on to the playoffs. The Leafs were often in the playoffs because they weren't the worst team around. The one funny thing about the Leafs in 1988 was that they actually beat the Detroit Red Wings to get into the Stanley Cup playoffs. Of course, the Red Wings would beat the tar out of the Leafs in that series. However, if the Leafs had lost that last game of the season, they would have been the team. They would have been the team out of the divisional playoffs, and that would have been Minnesota. And the funny thing is, the North Stars had the number 1 overall pick, so the Leafs would have ended up losing that game and getting the number 1 pick for the second time in 4 years. They got Wendell Clark at number 1 pick in 1985. I was born 10 days after the last game of the Leafs, or was it 9? No, 10. 10 days after the Leafs' final game of 1984-85, I was born. So, yeah. Yeah, and it was Mike Modano, number 1 pick. The Leafs would go through a lot of turmoil. Ballard would be condescending jerk. But in 1990, he died and left control of the Leafs to charity, but Steve Stavros stole everything. He basically lied, cheated, and manipulated himself to be the owner of the Leafs. But I digress. So the Leafs were doing terribly in the 1990s. They actually threw away the third overall pick in the 91 draft because 2 years earlier they needed a power play quarterback and traded for Tom Cougars and sent the Devils their first round pick in 91, not realizing how shitty they were going to be in 91. And that pick ended up being Scott Niedermayer, lest we forget. So anyway, the Leafs were faltering. However, Cliff Fletcher decided to become the new Leafs general manager, and he was bringing some savvy from Calgary, and also Doug Gilmour. Because in 1991-92, he engineered the 10-player trade that brought the Leafs back to a little bit of respectability. He got Doug Gilmour and Rick Nattrass and Jamie McCowan, among others. The Leafs also made a 7-player deal, sending their best scorer, Vincent Damphousse, to Edmonton for Grant Fuhrer, Craig Berube, and I forgot who the third guy is. Couldn't be Ken Linsman. It was someone else. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The Leafs were trying to get a goalie. Poor Grant Fuhrer. So anyway, we skipped the 93 season because I'll explain about the 93 Leafs later. In 94, the Leafs made their third trip to the Stanley Cup semifinals since their last Stanley Cup in 67. It was a weird one. They took out the Chicago Blackhawks and closed the door on Chicago Stadium forever because they beat the Blackhawks at Chicago Stadium last game. Mike Gardner, last goal in that arena. The Leafs would take on the surprising San Jose Sharks in the second round and actually were down 3-2. However, the Leafs had a little bit of advantage because in 94 and in 95, the Leafs decided that if a playoff series was held between Central and Pacific Division teams within the Western Conference, Leafs in the Central, Sharks in the Pacific, they would go 2-3-2 instead of the normal 2-2-1-1-1 format. So the Toronto Maple Leafs had Game 6 and 7 on home ice and won them both. Fantastic. So the Leafs would take on the Vancouver Canucks, who also were a massive surprise to get this far. The Canucks were the 7th seed, sinking the Calgary Flames in the first round thanks to 3 straight overtime wins. I'll get to that when I talk about the Canucks, of course. But anyway, the Leafs won Game 1 in overtime. It was like, yes, here we go. The Leafs are going to the Stanley Cup semifinals. Then they fucking blow their load and lose 4 straight to the Nucks. That would have pissed me off. But then again, the Leafs would have played the Rangers, and, sympathy card would have went to the Rangers. The Leafs in the late 90s had a few playoff runs, but then got taken out. And then they had a few years they didn't even make the playoffs. However, a shining knight, a former Hab, if you will, helped lead the way. Ken Dryden was made general manager, and he made things happen. Dryden was responsible for why the Leafs, when the NHL decided to realign to 6 divisions in 1999, were placed in the Eastern Conference and in a division with their close rivals Boston, Buffalo, Ottawa, and Montreal. Amazing. And then Toronto, the Northeast Division seemed to be spreading like wildfire. The Leafs ended up being one of the last teams standing in 1999. They were in the conference finals. They beat both Pennsylvania teams, Flyers and Pens, in 6 games before taking on the Sabres. And the Leafs had a golden chance in 1999 because the Sabres were without Mr. Hasek in net for Game 1. Unfortunately, the Leafs shit the bed against Dwayne Rollison. Yes, that is right. Dwayne Rollison was the goalie. And lost Game 1. They won Game 2, but then Hasek came back, and you can probably guess the Leafs were going to blow their load. And they did. The Leafs 3 years later would have another chance to get to the semifinals, to get to the Stanley Cup Finals. After a key series against the New York Islanders, winning in 7 games, in which each home team won that series. I remember the day after Game 7 going to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto with my classmates from Waterloo, Oxford Secondary School. Yeah. And then the Leafs were down 3-2 to the Senators in the semifinal, in the conference semifinals, but they found a way, winning Game 6 and 7 to take it all. Now, of course, that was not the Game 7 which Patrick Lalime shit the bed. That was 2004. However, the Leafs were overconfident against the Carolina Hurricanes. Carolina just took down their rivals Montreal in the Stanley Cup semifinals, which Montreal choked that big a potential 3-1 lead. They were up big in that third period, but more on that later in my Montreal one. So regardless, Toronto losing to Carolina in 6 games was just terrible. I'm like, that could be my what if. But there's a reason why the 93 Leafs are my what if. Carolina would then go on to lose to Detroit in the Stanley Cup Finals. That was, I think, the best chance. I mean, Carolina was just Arthur Irbe. If it wasn't for Irbe, I think Carolina would have been craptacular. The Leafs, unfortunately, have not won a playoff series since 2004. They've been to the playoffs not too many times since 2004. In fact, it took 9 years before they finally got to the playoffs in 2013. And oh my God, they were down 3-1 to Boston. I figured that was it. There was no way the Leafs were going to come back from 3-1 against the Bruins. But games 5 and 6, boy howdy, I was wrong. 3-3. Thinking, oh my gosh, maybe they will win game 7. And 4-1 in the third period. Yippee-ki-yay. A playoff matchup with the New York Rangers on the horizon in the second round. And then it fell apart in the final 10 minutes of the third period. 4-4, overtime. Patrice Bergeron scores. It just upset me. In fact, that was the day before my Target initiation thing. Because we had to go to Target orientation, the next day. The Leafs have lost game 7s in Boston in the past 2 years, and that's been ruining things. So the Toronto Maple Leafs are ready to go. We're ready to go. All that. A fun fact, even though I've been working at locations for like 9+ years, the Leafs have never played a playoff game while I was working. Now you'd be thinking, what are you talking about? So here's what I'm saying. In 2013, the Leafs made the playoffs, of course. And then, as I said, Target's orientation was the day after Game 7. That's Game 7 choke job. I would have considered myself an active Target member when the Leafs would have been in the second round against the NY Rangers. However, in 2013, I suffered a big loss as Sellers closed down in January. So January 2013, I was out of a job, and then I came back in May. But that was, unfortunately, after the Leafs choked the first round. But that was because of a stupid strike that basically just a few days after I lost my job at Sellers, that season started. And 2017, 2018, 2019, I haven't been able to, I didn't find work now. I didn't find work, so obviously it wasn't working while they went to the playoffs. 2019, it'll be different, I hope, this year, because I have a job right now, and hopefully I don't lose it. So let's talk about the 1993 Toronto Maple Leafs, why don't we? One of the best teams of all time. They almost got 100 points. They were 1 point short of 100 points in the season. 44, 29, and 11 on the year. Grant Fuhr was basically the goalie, but then a young Felix the Cat Potvin, who was a great AHL goalie in the previous year, came up and basically took Fuhr's number 1 position away from him. No big deal. The Leafs dealt Fuhr to Buffalo, a team that would care for a goalie. Buffalo needed a goalie in the stretch drive. They sent Dave Andreychuk to the Leafs, and Andreychuk put up 25 goals as a Leaf. That's amazing. When you have stars like Doug Gilmour and Wendell Clark also on the team, you know things would be big and all that. And let's not forget that, Potvin was huge. Let's not forget that the Leafs were playing in a tough division. Their 99 points actually only ended up third in that season, behind the Chicago Blackhawks and Detroit Red Wings. As the Leafs were number 3 in the last divisional playoffs until 2013. The Leafs would end up facing number 2 Detroit. Of course, Detroit would have home ice if there was Game 7, which there was a Game 7. Despite the Leafs winning Game 5 at home on the road on a Mike Foligno overtime goal, the Leafs were beaten at home, and we had a Game 7. The Leafs were tough, but Wendell Clark led the way. And who can forget that famous play when Rouse shot the puck in and it went up Borshevsky's stick and in the net, and the Wings were taking a loop, taking it back. They're like, what the fuck? What happened? The good news for the Wings is that that loss actually got them Scotty Bowman, who left Pittsburgh for some reason. But anyway, the Red Wings stunk like bad fish. And now you have the St. Louis Blues, who shocked Chicago, the number one team in the NHL. Well, the number one team in the Western Conference. Not only did they beat the Blackhawks, they swept the Blackhawks. I kid you not. The Blackhawks were swept. The Blues would now take on the Leafs. Thankfully, the Leafs' number 3 spot in the division meant that they would have a Game 7/home ice advantage. The Leafs won Game 1 on a double overtime goal by Dougie Gilmour, that famous wraparound on Cujo, who would have been a beloved Toronto Maple Leaf goalie. Who would be a beloved Leaf goalie 5 years later. Unfortunately, Jeff Brown also had double overtime magic, and he's won it in Game 2. The Leafs and Blues were just basically trading wins. And then in Game 7, the Leafs had home ice and won 6-0. Wendell Clark's home alone goal, if you will. Basically, St. Louis thought they had it in the bag. Cujo just didn't play his game. So the Leafs then took on the Los Angeles Kings in the conference finals. Leafs had home ice for that. Good for them. The Kings came off shocking wins over Calgary and Vancouver, to say the least. The Leafs won Game 1 and also won a moral victory as Wendell Clark stood up for his teammate Gilmour, who was leveled by Marty McSorley. Pat Burns wanted Barry Melrose's head on a platter, and McSorley got bombarded with tons of hated phone calls. How do you expect to live? So anyway, it was 2-2 that series until Game 5 when Glenn Anderson scored a key overtime goal. And you're thinking the Leafs now just have to win Game 6 in Los Angeles, and they have a trip to the Stanley Cup Finals. Montreal won the previous day, the Eastern Finals. So basically Montreal was going to face the Leafs. So now you have the Leafs and Kings. Wendell Clark saved the Leafs bacon. A big hat-trick goal with 3 minutes left sent the game to overtime when things unraveled for the Leafs. Doug Gilmour was cut by a Wayne Gretzky high stick. Most people thought it was 5 in a game. But Gretzky didn't get any penalty. He didn't get the 5 minutes. He didn't even get a 2-minute minor. That would have been sufficient enough. Kerry Fraser explained that it was the follow-through of Gretzky's stick that clipped Gilmour. That's why Gilmour was hurt. The worst part was that the Leafs were shorthanded and Gretzky scored the overtime winner. Talk about adding salt to the wounds. And Kerry Fraser nearly had tens of death threats because of that game. Game 7 was at Maple Leaf Gardens on a Saturday night. You're thinking, okay, well, that's fine. The Leafs have to win at home. Unfortunately, Wayne Gretzky decided to use this game to get the piano off his back, as Bob McKenzie, stupid Bob McKenzie, actually said that Gretzky was playing like he had a piano on his back. So unfortunately, Gretzky took that and put the hat trick against the Leafs in Game 7. The Leafs were close. They only lost 5-4, but Gretzky was why the Kings were this far anyhow. Kings would go on to lose to the Canadiens. At least Montreal was good for something. So now we have this thing. Now this what if is, what if the Leafs actually beat the Kings? So now they take on the Canadiens in the playoffs. It would be best of 7, just like normal. The Habitants have home ice advantage because they got more points. So, and I think they would have won Game 1 anyway. So anyway, we're going to set up the Leafs and the Canadiens 1993 Stanley Cup playoffs. Dumb as it. So Leafs and Habs, you see there, like the starting lineups. We don't do any changes with the starting lineups. Playoff format, that means that no shootouts. So just like it would be. Game 1 sees the Leafs win 7-2. Sorry, home team won 7-2. So the Canadiens won 7-2. Yikes. A power play goal by Vincent Dompoos in the first period. At 4:48 from Bellows and Schneider made it 1-0. Clark was off for holding. Then the Habs had another power play goal with Clark going off for clipping. Schneider from Bellows. Brian Bellows, Kitchener! Ranger. And then John LeClaire scored a goal to make it 3-0. There was a lot of fight. In the second period, there was a controversial penalty between Dompoos and Wendell Clark. Gary Lehman gets pissed off and gets caught for 10 minutes for unsportsmanlike conduct. Now, people forget that Lehman was part of the 93 Habitants at that time, which was strange. But, I mean, yeah, Gary Lehman a couple of years ago was a Leaf. He was actually sent to Calgary in that trade for Gilmore. And then Lehman decided enough was enough. I've got to get out of here. So he was traded to Montreal for Brian Skrudland. Bob Rouse scored a goal to make it 3-1. John LeClair then scored in the 4-1 goal by assisting by Carbonneau and Schneider. And then Don Poos scored with Schneider and Lehman with assists. Lehman, a couple of minutes after he got his 10-minute penalty, scored an assist. Pot then gets the boot for Fuhrer. Denny Savard scores a goal to make it 6-1. Ed Roden and Matt Schneider. Then Gilmore scored a goal from Eldon and Gill. John LeClair puts up a hat trick in the final few seconds. So 7-2 your score. So you see the lineups and all that. See some names such as Sylvain Lefebvre for the 93 Leafs. Bill Burke, Bob McGill, Rob Pearson, Drake Berehowski. And for Montreal, you see Loyal Oderline, Stephen LeBeau, Kevin Holler, Sergei Danino, Todd Ewing, Ed Rowland, Mario Robarge, Benoit Brunet, Paul DiPietro. Bot then sucked in net. Fuhrer did well. Patrick Waugh, 94%. You see the stars of the game, Schneider, LeClair, and Dumpoos. So, we go to game 2. The Leafs decide that Pot then needs another chance. And the plan worked as the Leafs get their revenge 6-2. John Cullen scores the first goal from Glenn Anderson. Gill scored a goal from Wendell Clark and Dave Anderchuk make it 2-0. Brian Bellows, Kitchener, scores on a goal off the rebound of Desjardins, 2-1. That was a power play goal as Rouse got booted for unsportsmanlike conduct. In period number 2, Mironov scored on the power play after Savard went for charging. Borshevsky with this. Wendell Clark scored with Dave Anderchuk and Gilmore getting an assist. Gary Lehman scored to make it 4-2, but just before the third period started, Mironov scores from Anderchuk and Gilmore. Waugh is gone. Freddie Chabot comes in the net. Mike Foligno scores one less ending goal to make it 6-2. So you see everything around. Chabot did fine. 1 goal on 12 shots. That's not bad. Mironov, Anderchuk, and Clark were the heroes of the game for the Leafs. So at 1-1, that's switcheroo, dunkaroo. Both teams have had a blowout victory. And the Leafs win game 3, 7-3. Todd Ewing. I didn't think he was a goal scorer. He scored from Schneider 1-0. Peter Cecil on a shorthanded break after Borshevsky went off for charging from Lefebvre makes it 1-1. Power play goal for the Leafs. Dumpoos had the penalty for closing the hand on the puck. Borshevsky scores from Gillen Clark. Cecil makes it 3-1. And then a penalty shot after a hooking call. Mike Krusheletsky. I forgot he played for the 93 Leafs. He scores to make it 4-1. Dave Ellie made it 5-1 from Cecil. Kevin Holler scores a goal from Savard 5-2. Brian Bellows, Kitchener, scores a goal from Schneider and Dumpoos. Make it 5-3. Todd Gill gets a goal to make it 6-3 and was chased from the net again. Peter Cecil puts up a hat trick on a goal from Elliott and Gill. Peter Cecil, of all people. I didn't think he would have done that, but he did. Chabot did well in net. 1 goal and 15 shots. Cecil, Gill, Elliott are your heroes. On to game 4. And again, the Leafs win 5-3, so they're 1-1 away. Eric Desjardins scored a booming shot from Moeller after Ewing gets penalized for elbowing. Borshevsky from Gilmore and Clark made it 1-1. Todd Gill then put up a goal at 7:27 to make it 2-1. Doug Gilmore scored to make it 3-1. In the second period, there were 3 goals. Stephen LeBeau, 6 minutes into the game of the second period, made it 3-2 from Keane and Desjardins. Wendell Clark scores from Mironov at 4-2. And then the Leafs again chase Waugh in the net for Chabot as Borshevsky scores from Clark and McCowan 5-2. Desjardins scores a late goal for a second of the night. See there? Shabbat does pretty well in the third period. So poor Patrick Waugh. Obviously, you can't put Shabbat in the net for Game 5. Montreal would have a fit if Waugh wasn't their starter. So Montreal needs to win. Keep the dream alive. Pass. Mironov. Gilmore. Borshevsky. Scores! Nikolai Borshevsky. Power play goal. Desjardins must have been in the box. Why did I cross-check the guy? 1-0. 3 minutes left. Here comes Bourgeois Daniel to LeBeau. Score! Stephen LeBeau. We're knotted at ones. Second period. Haller off for roughing. Clark gives it to Gilmore. Here comes the shot. Score! From the point. Pow, pow, pow. Power play goal. Dmitry Mironov. 2-1 Leafs. Final minutes. Clark gives it to Gilmore. Here comes Anderchuk. Scores! Dan Anderchuk. 3-1. There he is. He's not a ghost. First minute of third period. Here comes Elliott to Gilmore. Anderchuk scores! Dan Anderchuk. 4-1 Leafs. They might have the cup in their hands. Here comes Berg is off for charging. Shot score! Leaving to Brian Bellows. Kitchener. Brian Bellows, the former Kitchener Ranger, makes it 4-2. Here comes Brisebois, gives it to Chaberdian. Scores! Kitchener! Another Kitchener Ranger scores. It's Chaberdian, part of the 1990 team that went to the Mem Cup final. It's 4-3. I think I spoke too soon. Now here's Colin to Anderson. Scores! Glenn Anderson! 5-3 Leafs. That's the playoff. Thunder. Here comes Desjardins. Desjardins scores. Desjardins. It's 5-4. Amazing. Was pulled. Here comes Muller. Shoots. Stopped by Potvin. Wrist shot. Back to Bellows. Shoots. Snap. Oh, saved by Potvin. Don't lose has a chance. No, he missed the net. And the Toronto Maple Leafs are your 1993 Cup champions. Unbelievable. They had a Game 1 disaster, but pulled themselves together to win 4 straight. They chased Waugh 3 times. And it's a 5-4 game. Come get the cup, Doug Gilmore. Great job. Doug Gilmore, Wendell Clark, Todd Gilt, Dave Allen, Dmitry Mironov, Jamie McCown, Sylvain Lefebvre, Bob Rouse, Nikolai Borshevsky, Dave Anderchuk, John Cullen, Mike Krzyzewski, Glenn Anderson, Bill Berg, Mike Foligno, Peter Sezzo, Rob Pearson, Bob McGill. They'll all get the cup. All their names on the cup. Montreal can't believe it. Potvin, that pathetic Game 1 loss, and he came back to win it. Gilmore, Anderchuk, Brisebois are your 3 stars. Doug Gilmore is named Conn Smythe champion. Attaboy, Dougie. Attaboy. And the Montreal Forum sees another team take a Stanley Cup in their own building. The 89 Flames. Ironically, Gilmore played for the 89 Flames, and now he gets to race the Stanley Cup in the opponent's rink for the Flames. Well done, Toronto. You've made us all proud. Why the hell can't we get a time machine and stop 1993 Kings Canadian series and have Leafs Canadians? It would be good for the country and good for the Stanley Cup. 100th anniversary of the Stanley Cup of the team Leafs Habs. Right where we started from. Dun, 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 dun. We're gonna get right back to where we started from. No way. Habs have the cup. We're gonna beat you bad. We just won the cup. Do, 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 do. We just won. Good night.